Hello everyone, Review Prof here, and in this video I'll be covering the Mimics Book 2 Chapter 2, the latest chapter that's added to the Mimic. A lot has changed for this horror game series since the beginning. I still remember playing the Mimic for the first time with friends when it first blew up. That was 2 years ago now. However, Jealousy Chapter 2 represents the biggest gap that the game has ever had. This chapter took a year's worth of waiting, so of course going into this chapter I certainly had higher expectations than normal, and while I think it did meet some of the expectations that I had for this chapter, it fell flat in other areas too. First of all, I just want to say that Jealousy Chapter 2 is the biggest departure from what the Mimic is all about, at least from a gameplay perspective. Jealousy Chapter 1 was the result of everything the Mimic was about up to that point, solving puzzles while monsters chase after you. That's literally the Mimic summarized in one sentence. Jealousy Chapter 1 was the maturation of everything that the Mimic was up to that point, and that's why in my opinion it was such a good chapter. A lot of the level design in that map was very well executed, very mature. The puzzles were very fun in my opinion, but the problem is that it felt a bit too conventional. Other than the chase scene, a lot of the ideas in Jealousy Chapter 1 was a rehash of a lot of the ideas seen in the Control chapters already, although with a few changes. I really like that part where you had to paint though, that was really nice. So with the release of this new chapter, it seems that it has tried a lot of new things. This is clearly a very ambitious chapter right from the start. The crouch walk was one of the things that caught me off guard the first time that I played it. Up to that point, the crouch button was kinda put to the side. You know, not a lot of people except for hardcore Mimic players really knew how the crouch button actually worked, but this level brings the crouch button into something that feels more necessary. The horror aspect of the Mimic is still there, but in my opinion it takes more of a back seat compared to the other chapters, and puzzles take more of a center stage in this game. The mathematics part of the Mimic is a really good example of this. Using Japanese kanji for values really ties it in with the lore of the Mimic, and it also is a great departure from the running for monster thing, and which I really welcome. The cooking section though is a bit of a disappointment. I don't like how half-hearted the implementation of this thing is. I have no problems with the cooking mechanics, I think they're fine, but I just wish that it would have been possible to have gotten a good ending if you did the cooking right, instead of getting thrown to the chase scene no matter how well you do. It gives off the impression that they're not confident in the implementation of the cooking feature, and so they don't want to give any merit to it whatsoever. But what I've also noticed is that the bread and butter, which are literally just the monster chases, it seems to have deteriorated in quality. The meat section felt a bit too straightforward for it to be anything fun. The entire map for that meat corridor was literally just 3 corridors. It's really bland. After the first try, the difficulty and scariness of that level seems to just drop to almost zero, whereas in the previous chapters the layout will be much more compelling. Let's now talk about its biggest strength, which is the pacing. In the first half of the chapter, there are levers for you to turn on, which really slows down the game, and some people may find that boring, but I find this to be a welcome addition to be honest, as it really helps you digest whatever that has happened and gives you just enough time to wonder what's coming next. The chase scene seems to be way more elaborate this time around. In Jealousy Chapter 1, the chase will pretty much just be you running into a straight line, but the second chase really impressed me to be honest, with the moving structures and deviating paths, and also the ladders as well. It's a huge highlight in this chapter, and the more methodical sections like the tower give a more balanced experience to complement the more action-packed parts. Personally, the flow of this chapter is the best compared to any Mimic chapter before it. Nothing comes close to this thing, even Jealousy Chapter 1. The only issue is the notes, in which I find to be awful. You have an action scene which is playing hide and seek, and right before the boss fight, the game kills off any momentum it has by telling you to go get some notes. Like really? The concept of getting notes by itself is incredibly boring. The monster that they gave to this level is even more boring. You just have to just walk. If you walk, he can't get you, bro. I wish they had added in a more action-packed part into the end instead of just collecting notes. And the boss fight was a bit of a disappointment, if I gotta be honest. The gameplay aspect of firing cannons at Nagisa is a good concept on paper, but the problem is I really hate how they implemented this thing. The problem is a lot of the time it's hard to hit Nagisa, and not in like a good way, it's in a way that's almost annoying, where you have to wait for her to show her face before you hit her. And 3 attack patterns? Bro, this thing is so repetitive. I just hate how much health it has even in normal mode. I just wanted it for it to be over with. Jealousy Chapter 1's ending, although much more conventional, was a much better ending in my opinion. The 3-4 concept and lighting up candles in each one is that one. It's not anything that's revolutionary of course, but it felt way more fun compared to just waiting for Nagisa to show her face so you can shoot at her again. I can still acknowledge the ambition behind this boss fight though. It's the first ever proper boss fight from the Mimic, not counting the one in Control Chapter 4 because that was just a glorified maze if I gotta be honest. But but the implementation of it was so weak that when I finally finished the boss fight, I felt more relief than excitement, if I gotta be honest. Another thing I gotta compliment this game for is Nightmare mode. I felt it was way more compelling compared to the usual standard Nightmare mode we're typically given. The boss fight now has phases, which I thought should have been in normal mode too. Just reduce the damage on Nagisa, up the player's health or something, make it easier for normal mode. It should have been there as well, because the game was just so dry on normal mode without any phases. The attacks were much more fluid, the game flowed better, and after completing it, I felt way more satisfied compared to the original. The Nightmare mode in Jealousy Chapter 2 is really good. Way better in fact. The Nightmare mode in Jealousy Chapter 2 really enhances the game in my opinion. I think that's because the gameplay in here is way more varied compared to previous chapters, and so the developers had more ways of upping the difficulty instead of just doubling the speed of every monster and calling it a day. I finished it as well, and I gotta say, it's such an upgrade and way more fulfilling compared to the previous Nightmare chapters. So to wrap this up, how do I feel about the Mimic as a whole? I came away from this chapter liking it a bit less than Jealousy Chapter 1. Number 1. I feel like the pacing of this chapter was really good until the end. It was definitely like the biggest and the most strongest thing about this entire chapter. And number 2, the experimentation of this chapter is a welcome change as well. Even though some of it was a bit of a mixed bag, it showed that the developers were at least willing to move the formula forward before it got stale. And even though there were some aspects in which I thought were mediocre, like the proper boss fight, there were some really good changes as well. I remember that part with the audio hide and seek thing. Yeah, that was really fun to be honest. And Nightmare mode was actually fun this time around and not just a rehash of the original. Of course, a lot of the core Mimic strengths are still here. World building, graphics, models are still some of the best ever seen before in Roblox. It's something that the Mimic has always been known for, and of course, I came away from this chapter liking it. It had a few mistakes, definitely there were a few blunders, definitely towards the end of this chapter, but it was a solid addition to the Mimic, and yeah, I'm really hungry to see what chapter 3 has to offer. I'm feeling a B on this thing, and if you want to see more Mimic, I recommend checking out my first Mimic video that I released a year ago. It's actually really funny, and yeah, I'll see you there.